Greetings, everybody. I want to spend a few minutes just sharing with you some small success stories of Christian community. I say small because they're like the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But we all know that Jesus is capable of taking small things and doing wonderful things with them. So we began to experience improved Christian community when we took advantage of 2 things. The first had to do with the differences in group dynamics with different group sizes. And the second one had to do with the use of media, including social media, in support of the church community. So, what we started to do was utilize the larger congregation for vision casting, promoting prayer and fasting, as well as delivering application-focused messages that we would ask the church to break up into smaller groups afterwards so that they could discuss how they can personally apply the messages to themselves. These little groups would have been around 2 to 3, up to about 12 persons in size. And in addition to that, we also decided to implement what we call micro groups of 3 to 4 persons that are same sex. And these groups would focus on deeper levels of transparency, vulnerability, and accountability. So, having gotten these group dynamics and the different focus of the different sizes, we quickly recognized that by making the videos of the messages available to the members on various media, such as on Facebook, YouTube, Vimeo, as well as our website, and utilizing the WhatsApp chat group for all of the messages, it was possible to have our messages available to our members 24/7 so that they can use them whenever they choose. In addition to that, we subscribe the entire congregations to Right Now Media. And Right Now Media is like the Netflix of Christian video. This allowed them to have at their disposal the kind of Christian media that will allow them to have personal discipleship as well as group discipleship. Now, having done that, we began to experience some interesting results. What we began to observe is that the members quickly began to utilize their groups outside of the sessions in which they would meet for church, so that the dynamics among the groups became far more intense, and these groups became closer together, they became far more bonded together. And when COVID-19 hit, it was easy for us to just transfer the groups on to Zoom breakout groups. And then we discovered that they stayed in their breakout groups on Zoom far longer than they would normally be able to stay in a face-to-face church service. In fact, we also discovered that they would meet during the week once, sometimes twice in their groups together. And then eventually we realized that what was happening in some of the congregations is that they were multiplying these groups. Members were starting groups with their own families and their friends. And they were including perhaps sometimes their neighbors. And in fact, because of the use of online and Zoom platform, they were able to include members who were outside of their national geographical boundaries. In fact, I recall having one of the members, or hearing about this one, where one of the members meets on a Sunday morning with about 25 members of her family scattered in different parts of the world. And that is all because they have caught the vision that the church's mission is to help people to come to Christ and to become like Christ. And it has to be done relationally. And as a result, once they have learned how to do this, we find that they are doing it spontaneously. Now, part of the results is that it is not confined to just like our little church group within Barbados and Trinidad. We discover that in Barbados, for example, one of our other church pastor friends from another denomination, appreciating what we were doing, prayerfully selected leaders of house churches and then divided up her congregation into house churches so that in addition to the larger congregation, she could take advantage of the smaller group dynamics. And what she began to discover is it added to the stability of the congregation, especially going through the pandemic. We also discovered that another friend, pastor friend of ours, out in Jamaica, what he did was begin to implement the smaller group meetings so that he could begin to build greater transparency, vulnerability, and accountability. And he too discovered that not only did the groups want to stay together longer when they were getting together to discuss the application of the message, but their listening changed. They were more attentive because now they knew they had to discuss how they would personally apply the messages to themselves. In addition to that, when he had the opportunity to come back into in-person church during a period of COVID-19 in Jamaica in which they were granted permission to do that, he realized that his church attendance had increased. In fact, I remember him calling me and asking me or telling me that he was wondering whether he should rent a new facility. And then he thought what he could do is simply have two church services in the same facility. And of course, that was a far more cost-effective solution, especially during COVID. But in addition to that, he also discovered that in his circuit or zone of 17 churches, over which he and his team were providing leadership, as they began to understand the reproducibility of what was happening in his church plant, even though their tenure for leading that 17 church circuit had ended last week, they asked them to stay on for another 2 years so that they could be in a position to sort of establish the process well within the 17 church circuit so that they too could be able to benefit as he was benefiting. Now here we're discovering a quiet multiplication or reproduction beginning to happen. There's another group within the Trinidad circuit that they also began to appreciate the benefits of doing church this way. And so their intentional discipleship group decided to begin the process of slowly introducing it to their wider circuit of 48 churches. Now, brothers and sisters, what we're discovering is this is a slow, intensive process, and it is very relationally dependent. And as I experienced what God was doing with us, I realized that the key to the process is the lead pastor's willingness to surrender to the lead of the Holy Spirit. Because what got me started on all of this is I was reading the book of Acts many years ago. I noticed in Acts chapter 2 that there were meetings both in the temple and in homes. And then I discovered in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 and 4, that when persecution broke out with the martyrdom of Stephen, the apostles were left in Jerusalem, but the rest of the church were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. And it was the scattered brethren who took that gospel wherever they went. And when I read that, I realized we were doing church wrong. Because I realized that if our pastors were taken off the scene, our members could not carry the gospel wherever they are. And that meant I had to change how we were doing church. So I had to learn how to share the gospel one-on-one in terms of personal discipleship. And then I had to learn group dynamics. I had to understand that. And so I did these things, began to share with the congregation as I learned, sat down with them and began to discuss applications of the messages that I would preach to myself as well as the others. So we were in the process of learning, equipping, and empowering together. And as we did that, while we got some pushback at the beginning, after a while, it set in. And when that culture set in, we discovered groups just began to take off and multiply. So what we're realizing is the method that Jesus gave us back in the Gospels is a method that still works today. In fact, what began to sink home to us is that we sort of accepted the teachings of Jesus, but didn't pay as much attention to his methods, the deeply relational, reproducible methods that Jesus used in doing church and in making disciples. And more now we're realizing that success hinges on this relational, obedience-based discipleship that Jesus demonstrated to us, in which information is not the driving force. Information is necessary, but it's not the driving force. The driving force is relationships. And so, as I conclude, what I'm appreciating is that the best we could do is follow Jesus as closely as possible through the lead of the Holy Spirit.